5 terrible cards that after years of doing nothing, suddenly went on to be meta powerhouses. Up first, Astral Communion, a card that went a literal decade's worth of time being nothing but a meme gathering dust in our collections, to then being the enabler behind one of the best wild decks of all time. Astral Communion was released on August 24th, 2015, and over the years people tried and tried to make Astral Druid work. The idea behind the deck was simple. Stuff your deck full of expensive cards, a few mana gaining and draw cards, and Astral Communion. From there, the plan was to play Astral Communion as soon as possible, and then play powerful expensive cards for the turns following, blowing your opponent out of the water with all the threats you cheated out. In reality, the deck didn't have enough good expensive cards, or good enough mana gaining and draw cards, and just had far too many awkward or wasted turns before it inevitably faced defeat. That all changed March 25th, 2025, when Ysera Emerald Aspect was released. 9 mana for attack, 12 health dragon, start of game. Increase both players' maximum mana by 5. Battlecry, gain 3 mana crystals. The reason this was so impactful is that it solved one of Astral Druid's biggest problems. You see, in order to win a game of Astral Druid, you have to conquer 3 problems. 1, you need to survive until you can play Astral Communion. 2, you need to reaccumulate cards to be able to take advantage of your gained mana. And then finally 3, use your big mana and big cards to overwhelm your opponent. Regardless of how good the other 28 cards in Astral Druid were, these problems were the deck's fatal flaw. With only 10 mana as your cap, you couldn't, for example, top deck a Moonlit Guidance, pick a 9 or 10 drop off of it, and make use of it that same turn. There were far too many examples of this where you weren't able to use that mana you now had well. This was sort of solved with Guff, but that meant you had to play Guff either before or after Astral Communion, and that was a clunky solution at best. With Ysera, you now ramp up to a max of 15 mana without having to play another card, which means when you play Astral Communion, you then have enough mana to be able to either draw a 10 mana card and play it, or draw a 0 to 5 mana card that lets you draw or discover said mana card and still then be able to play said card. This single addition removes all the wasted and awkward turns after Astral Communion, which effectively turns a 4 mana spell into a win the game when played spell. Ysera being added to the deck is the modern day equivalent to Jiraxxus being reduced to 8 mana, and you now being able to hero power the turn you play him if you so choose. In both cases, you can now do something that was previously impossible. With the addition of powerful draw, mana gaining, and expensive cards over the years, Astral was positioned perfectly for Ysera to come around and help it finally solve its 3 big problems that it needed to in order to be unlocked to terrorize players in the wild format. And terrorize it did, via enabling massive high rolls that often left the opponent with no choice but to tank the L and go to the next game. As a result, Blizzard decided to step in and raise the cost of Astral Communion from 4 to 5 mana, putting a nice bow on its story from 0 to hero. Whether it goes back to being total garbage or continues to terrorize the wild ladder experience is yet to be seen, as it has just been nerfed around the time this video was posted. Speaking of terrorizing the wild format, our next card is Spectral Pillager. What was once an unusable, turbo-expensive, terrible card that at best would deal a couple damage, eventually became the center of one of the quickest and highest skill cap combo decks in Hearthstone history. The deck has such a high skill cap that the only way anyone on Earth was able to play it perfectly was to use a calculator program that would read the cards in hand and tell you if you had lethal or not, and also tell you which cards you play in which order in order to perform the lethal if there was one. But even then, you were almost guaranteed to have made a mistake in one of the previous turns anyway. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's quickly establish the game plan of the deck. The strategy of Pillager Rogue revolved around primarily 3 core cards: Spectral Pillager, Scab's Cutter Butter, and Spirit of the Shark. The idea is to use Spirit of the Shark to double the effect of your Scabs, which then makes Spectral Pillager cost 0. And using the Shark also to make Spectral Pillager deal its damage effect twice. With that in mind, the typical combo turn involved playing cheap cards, like 0 mana coins created by a Mailbox Dancer, Shadow Steps, etc., in order to play enough cards that when you played Scabs followed by a 0 mana Pillager, the opponent would explode from its damage. This deck was crazy difficult to play, but also crazy stupid in how resilient and powerful it was when it reached its strongest form. You were able to perform lethal damage consistently on turns 3 through 5, even whilst your opponent played Dirty Rats and other disruption to try to stop you. On top of it being incredibly busted, as mentioned, it was also a calculator deck, potentially referred to as a cheater deck by some, which was the 2 strikes it needed to be sent straight to the gulag, resulting in Spectral Pillager being nerfed to, instead of dealing damage to whatever you wanted, to now dealing 2 damage, but only 2 minions. This is an incredible example of a terrible card that went on to be incredibly busted years later. Obviously, the cards in this video have different lengths of time between being bad in Standard and then being broken years later, usually in Wild. They can't all be the poster child that is Astral Communion that waited a full decade. Of these cards, Flurgle waited the least time. Actually, no time. The thing is, a 2 mana 2 attack 3 health minion that deals 1 damage to everything when you play a Murloc is one of those cards that looks like it should be amazing. But in reality, it's a card that only ends up being really good if it has incredible support. In Standard, it didn't. So it ended up being a strong card in a weak deck that couldn't properly utilize it. In Wild, however, it was absolutely broken, as it had the best companion it could possibly ask for, Toxfin. Toxfin gives Flurgle poison, which means that when Flurgle's ability deals 1 damage to all enemy minions, it kills them, no matter how much health they have, similar to any other minion with poison when it attacks. This 2-card combo also just so happened to be tutorable with Ice Fishing. The contrast between the underwhelming Standard Murloc Shaman and being one of the best 2-card combos in Wild is clear as day. From here, the Shaman Wild Murloc package would go on to be even stronger, with the release of Clownfish, the inclusion of Scargill, and more. This package allowed fully clearing your opponent's board, developing your own board, and eating a minion from your opponent's hand on turn 4. It also enabled drawing lots of cards. On top of Flurgle and Toxfin being a 2-card 3 mana infinite damage AoE that also develops stats, if you don't clear the Flurgle the turn after, then any other future Murloc played is also an infinite damage AoE, which prevents you from redeveloping the board. There's a lot more we could talk about here, but I think it's pretty clear now why this was really broken. So let's move on to the next card. Ancestor's Call. 4 mana, put a random minion from each player's hand into the battlefield. Early usage revolving around this card was control Malygos Shaman. The idea behind this deck was to use Barnes and Ancestor's Call to cheat out big minions, like Yashiraj, Sogoth the Slitherer, and Ragnaros. If this didn't overwhelm the opponent, the deck was also able to cheat out Malygos and capitalize on it with Lightning Bolt, Crackle, Lava Burst, and more. The deck also featured healing and damage AoE cards, hence the dual identity of control and combo Malygos Shaman. This deck and other decks that featured Ancestor's Call were not great win rate wise, but at least recognized some potential that Ancestor's Call had. After this short stint, Ancestor's Call sat dormant until the arrival of the big Shaman archetype in Wild Hearthstone. Suddenly, Ancestor's Call combined with Muckmorpher allowed Shaman to consistently cheat out big minions early, and in the modern game, they're cheating out stronger late game minions than ever. Whether it be Neptulon or Walking Mountain, the higher power level is clear. Using and reviving Walking Mountain allows you to clear most boards and fully heal your hero. Using Neptulon allows you to add on a Jam Session or Rockbiter weapon to one of the hands to essentially OTK the opponent, if it wasn't lethal already. This is the reality that Ancestor's Call enjoyers always dreamed of and tried to make happen. It just took around 10 years before it got to that point. Our next card is Nerubar Reblord, which is a 2 mana 1 attack 4 health minion that makes minions with battle cries cost 2 mana more. When everyone's playing Haunted Creeper, Paladin Shredder, etc., putting a Nerubar Reblord in your deck isn't even worth considering. Outside of druids experimenting with it in its early days, this status of being ignored was the case for Nerubar Weblord for more than half a decade. I suppose that's pretty obvious though, as releasing an anti-battlecry card in a death rattle adventure is a pretty obvious blunder. Not to mention in a fresh card game with limited cards, let alone battlecry cards. The game and its metas simply revolved too much around raw stats, death rattles, or a balance of many card types for there to be enough battlecries at any given point that you'd want to counter. But roughly 7 years later, in early 2021, the rise of Tax Paladin began. Paired with Call to Arms, Far Watch Post, Oh My Yogg, and more, the Aggro Paladin archetype packed full of disruption was born. The deck had surprising power in its own right, being able to cheat out a lot of minion and buff their attack in a lot of different ways, but also found itself positioned excellently against the other decks in the meta. The reason for this was that the decks in the meta, like Darkglare Warlock, heavily revolved around cheap battlecry cards in order to function. So you effectively made all of their cheap cards cost 3 instead of 1. This gave you plenty of time to flood and buff the board to deal lethal damage. Weblord continued to stick around for a couple years, as right around the corner was United in Stormwind, which famously released quest lines, which just so happened to feature rewards that had battle cries on them. This was an additional benefit for Nerubar Weblord. Later, Nerubar Weblord would also be used in Inner Fire Priest decks that involved Drekthar, and obviously all the spells you'd expect, which was another great deck that fought for board without relying on battle cries, which allowed Weblord to continue to shine. Eventually, the Darkglare Warlock deck and Inner Fire Priest deck, along with Drekthar, would be nerfed, and the meta would shift in a way that left Nerubar Weblord behind. But instead of being ignored and rotting on the shelf, he is quietly waiting in the wings on standby for if he's ever needed again. Another once terrible card turned success story. What are your favorite cards that went from being terrible to great over time? Perhaps I discussed it in a past installment of this series, which are now shown on screen. Thanks for watching.